The studio lights were warm, almost too warm, but he didn't seem to notice. He sat in the chair like someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Shoulders relaxed, hands folded loosely in his lap, eyes steady but kind. The audience had cheered when he walked in. Not the wild, screaming kind, but the respectful, almost reverent kind people reserve for someone who stayed quiet while the world got louder. He wasn't there to promote a movie. No premiere, no trailer, no flashy new role. Just a conversation. That's what the host had promised. An honest talk with someone who rarely gives them. For the first 20 minutes it was exactly that. Gentle, thoughtful, full of pauses. He spoke about loss, about kindness, about how strange it felt to be called iconic when all he'd ever tried to do was show up and do the work. Then, almost casually, he mentioned a trip he'd taken years ago. Not for a film, not for an event. Just a personal journey. He'd gone to Rome after a long stretch of grief, something he didn't name, but everyone in the room seemed to understand without asking. While there, through a quiet chain of introductions, he'd been invited to meet Pope Francis. The host leaned forward slightly. "You met the Pope?" He nodded. "Just once." It wasn't planned. "I wasn't expecting it," the audience murmured, soft, curious. Cameras zoomed in. "He didn't talk like a pope," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "He talked like a person, like someone who'd carried a lot and still chose to care." Then came the moment that would echo far beyond the studio. "He told me something I've never shared before," he said, voice dropping just enough to pull everyone closer. He said that sometimes late at night he wonders if the church is listening to the right voices. Not the ones shouting the loudest, but the ones crying quietly in the dark. He said he's afraid, not of losing power, but of losing touch. A beat of silence. The host blinked. The audience stilled. "He didn't say it like a confession," he added quickly. "More like a shared worry. Like we were both just two people trying to figure out how to be good in a world that makes it hard." The interview moved on, back to films, to motorcycles, to his dog, but the moment had already slipped out of the room. Within minutes, clips were posted online. Within an hour, they'd been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Keanu Reeves says Pope Francis doubts the church. Pope admits fear in private meeting. Hollywood star reveals Pope's secret struggle. None of it was exactly true, but that didn't matter. The internet doesn't deal in nuance. It deals in headlines. Backstage after the taping, he stood alone in a quiet hallway, still in his dark sweater, staring at his phone as it buzzed nonstop. His assistant hovered nearby, eyes wide. "It's everywhere," she whispered. "Vatican news outlets are picking it up." "CNN just quoted you." He didn't respond right away. He just exhaled, slow and deep, like someone trying to steady a boat in rough water. "I didn't mean to expose anything," he finally said. He trusted me with that. It wasn't a secret to be kept. It was a truth to be held gently. But the world doesn't hold things gently. By morning, the story had split into a dozen versions. Some praised him for humanizing a distant religious figure. Others accused him of breaching sacred trust. A conservative Catholic commentator called it a dangerous blurring of private faith and public spectacle. A progressive theologian wrote an op-ed titled, "Thank you, Keanu, for showing us a pope who breathes." Meanwhile, the Vatican remained silent. No statement, no denial. No confirmation, just quiet. He stayed off social media, didn't give follow-up interviews. For days he walked the same quiet streets near his home, hands in his pockets, head down. Neighbors saw him but didn't approach. They'd seen the clips too. They knew he wasn't just the guy from the movies anymore. He was the man who'd said something real at the wrong time, in the wrong way, to the wrong audience. What no one knew was how that meeting had actually happened. It wasn't glamorous. He'd been in Rome after a loss so deep it had hollowed him out. He wasn't looking for answers, just a place to sit without being recognized. A friend, knowing his state of mind, had quietly arranged a brief audience with a Monsignor who worked with the Pope's inner circle. It was meant to be a moment of peace, not a historic encounter. But when he arrived, the Pope himself was there, waiting not in robes but in a simple white cassock, sipping tea in a sunlit room filled with books. They didn't talk about doctrine. They talked about loneliness, about how hard it is to keep believing in goodness when the news is full of cruelty. The Pope asked about his grief. He asked about the Pope's burdens. And in that room, titles fell away. There was no Holy Father, no movie star, just two men, both carrying invisible weights. He'd never planned to speak of it. Not because it was secret, but because it felt too intimate, too fragile for the noise of the public square. But in the warmth of the studio, in the middle of talking about what it means to be human, the memory had surfaced like a breath he didn't know he was holding. Now, the cost of that honesty was unfolding in real time. Religious leaders debated whether his words undermined papal authority. Late-night comedians made gentle jokes about Keanu and the Pope's late-night heart-to-heart. Few fringe groups claimed it was proof of a crisis in the church. But, in living rooms and cafes and parish halls around the world, ordinary people were having quieter conversations. If even the Pope has doubts, one woman told her book club, maybe it's okay that I do too. A young seminarian wrote in his journal, "Faith isn't the absence of fear, it's walking with it." And still the Vatican said nothing. He watched the fallout from a distance, not with anger but with sorrow. Not for himself. He'd weathered storms before, but for the moment itself. What had been a thread of connection between two souls had become a weapon in someone else's argument. That hurt more than the criticism. One evening, sitting on his porch as the sun dipped below the hills, he received a call from an old friend, a priest he'd known since his 20s. "You didn't betray him," the priest said simply. "You honored him. By showing he's human, you made his compassion more real, not less." He didn't reply right away. He just watched a bird land on the fence, tilt its head, then fly off. Maybe that was enough, he thought. Maybe truth doesn't need to be perfect to be valuable. Maybe it just needs to be true. The world kept spinning. The headlines faded slightly, replaced by newer dramas. But something had shifted, subtly, quietly. People began using words like vulnerability and humility in places they hadn't before. And in a small office in Vatican City, a man in white robes read a transcript of the interview, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer marked "Moments of Grace." No one knew that yet. But it mattered, because sometimes the most shocking truths aren't scandals. They're reminders that even the most revered among us are just trying to find their way, one honest word at a time. The morning after the interview aired, the world felt different, not because anything had changed in the sky or the streets, but because something had shifted in the air between people. Conversations that usually stayed private were suddenly happening out loud. At bus stops, in office break rooms, over dinner tables, strangers and friends alike found themselves asking, "Do you think it's true? That even the Pope has doubts?" For him, the actor who'd spoken those few quiet sentences, the shift was less philosophical and more personal. He woke to a phone that wouldn't stop lighting up. Calls from agents, producers, journalists, even a few worried friends. His team gathered in his living room before sunrise, voices low, faces tense. "We need a statement," someone said. "Something to clarify you weren't revealing confidential information." He sat on the edge of his couch, wrapped in a worn-out sweater, shaking his head. "I didn't say anything he asked me to keep secret. He never said, 'Don't tell anyone.' He just shared something real, and I shared it the same way. But now it's everywhere," another voice pressed. "People are calling it a leak. A betrayal." He looked out the window. A neighbor was walking their dog, ordinary and calm, unaware that the man down the street had accidentally become the center of a global conversation about faith, truth, and boundaries. "I didn't betray him," he said softly. "I honored him by remembering what he said." Still, the weight pressed down, not from guilt but from responsibility. He hadn't meant to turn a private moment into public spectacle. And now, people were using his words as ammunition, some to attack the church, others to defend it, none really listening to what had actually been said. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in seminaries and parishes and quiet monasteries, the ripple spread. A theology professor in Boston paused his lecture to read the transcript aloud. "Notice," he told his students, "he didn't say the Pope lost faith. He said he worries about losing touch. That's not weakness, that's awareness." In a small town in Poland, an elderly woman lit a candle and whispered a prayer not for the Pope's strength, but for his peace. In Nairobi, a youth group debated whether leaders should show doubt or always appear certain. The conversation wasn't about scandal. It was about humanity, but not everyone saw it that way. Online, the noise grew louder. Critics accused him of exploiting a spiritual moment for attention, never mind that he'd avoided the spotlight for decades. Others claimed the Pope's words, if true, signaled a crisis in the Church's authority. A few far-right commentators spun wild theories about liberal Hollywood corrupting the Vatican. None of it was based on facts. But facts rarely win in a storm of emotion. He watched some of it, then turned it off. It felt like watching a play where he'd been cast without his consent. His publicist urged him to do damage control, a short interview, a carefully worded apology. "Just say you misspoke," she suggested gently. "It'll calm things down." He shook his head. "I didn't misspeak. I spoke from the heart. If that's a problem, I can't fix it by pretending otherwise." That afternoon, he went for a long walk in the hills behind his house. No phone, no earbuds. Just the sound of wind through the trees and his own thoughts. He remembered the Pope's eyes, warm, tired, deeply kind. He remembered how the man had leaned forward when he spoke about grief, as if truly listening, not just waiting to respond. That moment hadn't been about religion or fame. It had been about two people acknowledging how hard it is to carry hope in a broken world. Why did that feel so dangerous now? Back in Rome, the silence from the Vatican continued. But behind closed doors, conversations were happening. Cardinals exchanged notes. Advisors debated whether a response was needed. Some feared the remarks would erode public trust. Others quietly admitted they found the Pope's alleged words comforting. Even the most faithful among them had nights when doubt crept in like fog. To hear their leader might feel the same wasn't a threat. It was a relief. Then a Jesuit priest in Argentina, someone who'd known the Pope since long before he wore white, gave an interview to a local paper. "This isn't surprising," he said, sipping mate from a gourd. "He's always said the church must smell like the sheep, not like incense. If he worries about losing touch, it's because he cares too much, not too little." The quote spread slowly, then quickly. It didn't go viral like the original clip, but it landed in the right places, in thoughtful articles, in sermons, in late-night texts between friends wrestling with their own beliefs. For him, though, the personal cost grew heavier. Invitations to events were quietly withdrawn. A charity he'd supported for years asked if he'd refrain from public appearances for a while. Not out of anger, just caution. In the world of public image, uncertainty was riskier than controversy. He understood, but it still stung. One evening, he visited a small church downtown. Not his usual place, just one he'd passed 100 times. He sat in the back pew, head bowed, not praying exactly, just being still. An older woman beside him glanced over, recognized him but said nothing. After a while, she slid a small pamphlet onto the seat between them. On the cover, "Doubt is not the opposite of faith, indifference is." He held it in his hands like a gift. Later, walking home, he passed a bookstore with a display in the window. Titles on compassion, on listening, on leading with humility. One book featured a quote from Pope Francis: "A shepherd should have the smell of the sheep." He smiled faintly. Maybe the message was getting through, not through headlines, but through quiet echoes. His team met again the next day. This time the mood was different. A major news network had reached out, not for a sensational take, but for a reflective piece on vulnerability and leadership. A documentary filmmaker asked if he'd consider sharing more about that meeting, not for drama, but for depth. Even his agent admitted, "People aren't mad at you. They're curious about what it means to be human." He still didn't want to speak more, but he began to wonder if staying silent now might be its own kind of betrayal, not of the Pope, but of the truth they'd both touched that day in Rome. That night, he wrote a few lines in a notebook. "I didn't share his words to expose him. I shared them because they gave me hope. And if hope is worth anything, it's worth passing on, even if it shakes the ground a little." He didn't post it, didn't send it to anyone, but writing it down made the weight feel lighter. Outside, the city hummed on, cars, laughter, distant sirens. Ordinary life, full of ordinary people carrying extraordinary questions. Somewhere, a priest was counseling a teenager afraid to admit he didn't believe everything he was taught. Somewhere, a mother was whispering a prayer she wasn't sure anyone heard. Somewhere, a leader was staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., wondering if they were doing enough. And in that shared uncertainty, there was a strange kind of unity. He closed the notebook and turned off the light. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, it was changing shape, from a hurricane of noise into a steady rain that could help something grow. What happened next wouldn't be loud, but it might be real, and sometimes that's enough. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a postcard from a film festival in Lisbon. It was cream-colored, slightly thicker than regular mail with no return address, just his name written in careful, looping handwriting. He almost missed it, tossing the rest of the mail onto the kitchen counter without a second thought. But something about the weight of it, the quiet dignity of the paper, made him pause. He turned it over. No logo, no Vatican seal, just a simple fold, sealed with a dot of red wax that looked like it had been pressed by hand. His stomach tightened. He hadn't expected this. Not really. He'd imagined a formal letter from some office in Rome, maybe a polite rebuke or a neutral acknowledgement. But this felt different, personal. He carried it to the backyard where the morning sun was just beginning to warm the air. Sat on the old wooden bench beneath the lemon tree, his thinking spot, and carefully broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The same handwriting. The words were in English, though he knew it wasn't the Pope's first language. That alone told him how much care had gone into this. Dear friend, thank you for your honesty. In a world that often confuses strength with silence, you chose to speak with tenderness. What you shared was not a secret betrayed, but a truth offered in trust, and that is a sacred thing. Yes, I have doubts. Not about God, but about us. About whether we are building bridges or walls in His name. If my words gave you even a moment of comfort during your own darkness, then they served their purpose. Do not carry guilt for speaking what is true. The light does not fear the shadow. It simply walks through it, with gratitude and peace. He read it 3 times, then folded it slowly, hands trembling just a little, not from fear but from something deeper, relief maybe, or recognition. This wasn't damage control. It wasn't PR. It was a human being reaching across continents to say, I see you. And you were right to remember. He didn't show it to anyone. Not his team, not his closest friends. Some things are too precious to broadcast. But that letter changed everything. For days he carried it in his coat pocket like a talisman. Whenever the noise of the outside world grew too loud, the hot takes, the think pieces, the endless replays of that one interview clip, he'd step outside, touch the folded paper, and breathe. It reminded him that truth, when spoken gently, doesn't destroy, it connects. Meanwhile, the public conversation began to shift. Not all at once, but steadily, like a river changing course after a storm. A popular podcast host dedicated an entire episode not to dissecting the Pope's alleged confession, but to exploring what it means for leaders, religious, political, even parental, to admit uncertainty. What if doubt isn't weakness, she asked her listeners, but the first step toward real listening? In classrooms, students wrote essays about humility and leadership. One high school in Chicago held a town hall where teens and teachers talked openly about times they'd pretended to have answers when they didn't. A retired bishop in Ireland gave a homily quoting the actors' words, not to defend or attack, but to say faith isn't a fortress. It's a journey we take together even when the path is unclear. And then, quietly, the Vatican released a statement. Not a denial. Not a scolding. Just 3 short paragraphs. Pope Francis has long emphasized the importance of encounter, dialogue, and human vulnerability as essential to spiritual life. While private conversations remain private, the Holy Father affirms that questions asked in sincerity are never a threat to faith, but often its deepest expression. We encourage all people to approach one another with compassion, especially when speaking of matters close to the heart. It wasn't dramatic. No press conference, no grand gesture. But in religious and media circles, it was seen for what it was, a quiet endorsement. Not of the interview itself, but of the spirit behind it. For him, that was enough. He still avoided the spotlight. Turned down talk shows, skipped award events, kept his phone on silent most days. But something inside him had settled. He wasn't running from the fallout anymore. He was learning to live with it, with grace, not guilt. One afternoon, he visited a community center in South Los Angeles. Not for photos, not for publicity. He'd been quietly supporting their youth mentorship program for years, showing up to help fix bikes or serve meals when no cameras were around. That day, a teenager asked him, "Were you scared when everyone got mad at you?" He thought about it. "Not scared," he said. "More sad, because I never wanted to hurt anyone, But I also couldn't pretend the moment didn't matter. The teen nodded. My pastor said the same thing last Sunday. He said it's okay to not have it all figured out. They sat in silence for a while, tightening bolts on an old bicycle frame. The sun came through the warehouse windows, dust floating in the beams like tiny stars. Later, walking back to his car, he realized something. The story wasn't really about him or the Pope, it was about permission. Permission to be unsure, to ask hard questions, to say, I'm trying instead of, I know. That night, he called his publicist. I think I'm ready to talk again, he said. Not to explain, just to listen. She was surprised. To who? To anyone who's been sitting with their own quiet truth, he said. Maybe it's time we stop treating vulnerability like a flaw. The next week, he agreed to a single interview, not on a flashy late-night show, but on a modest podcast run by a former seminarian who now worked with homeless youth. No audience. No live stream. Just two voices talking about grief, doubt, and the courage it takes to stay open in a world that rewards certainty. He didn't mention the letter, but he spoke about the meeting in Rome with such tenderness, such reverence, that listeners said it felt like being invited into a sacred space. After it aired, messages poured in, not from celebrities or news outlets, but from ordinary people. A nurse who cried during her break, a father who played the episode for his skeptical son, a woman who'd left the church years ago but said, for the first time, I felt like maybe I could come back, not because I had to believe everything, but because I could bring my questions with me. And in a small room in Vatican City, a man in white robes heard about the podcast. He smiled, made a note in his journal, and added a line to his next homily. Truth does not need armor. It only needs a heart willing to speak it, and ears willing to hear it. No one connected the dots publicly, but those who were paying attention felt it. Something gentle was growing in the cracks of the noise. What happened next wouldn't make headlines, but it would change lives, quietly, deeply, the way real things often do. He didn't go to the church to be seen. He went because the noise inside his head had finally quieted enough for him to hear something else. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm has passed. It was a small parish in East Los Angeles, tucked between a laundromat and a family-run bakery that still made tamales on Sundays. The building wasn't grand, just stucco walls, a faded red door, and a bell that hadn't worked in years. But it felt real, like a place where people came not to perform faith, but to live it. He slipped in through the side entrance during the afternoon lull, wearing a plain black cap and an old denim jacket. No one recognized him at first. He sat in the very back pew, head bowed, not praying exactly, just resting. The air smelled like old wood and candle wax, and sunlight slanted through stained glass in soft pools of color across the floor. For weeks, he'd carried the weight of that interview, the misinterpretations, the backlash, the unexpected kindnesses. But here, none of that mattered. Here, he was just another person trying to make sense of things. After a while, a young man in a collar came out from the sacristy, holding a stack of bulletins. He paused when he saw him, did a double take, then walked over slowly, not with fanfare, but with the quiet caution of someone who'd learned not to assume. Didn't expect to see you here, the priest said. Voice low. Didn't expect to be here, he replied with a small smile. Just needed a place to sit. They didn't talk about the interview. Not right away. Instead, they spoke about the neighborhood, the kids who hung out on the corner after school, the elderly couple who came every morning to light a candle for their grandson overseas, the broken AC unit they couldn't afford to fix, normal things, human things. Then, as they stood near the empty baptismal font, the priest sighed. I've been thinking about what you said. About the Pope. Not the headlines, the actual words. He hesitated. I've been having my own doubts lately, about whether I'm cut out for this. Whether the church even matters to people my age anymore. He looked at the young priest, maybe late 20s, eyes tired but earnest, and saw himself years ago, trying to do good in a world that kept changing the rules. I think it matters more because it's messy, he said. Not less. They talked for nearly an hour, about loneliness, about feeling like you're failing even when you're trying your hardest, about how hard it is to lead when you don't have all the answers. It wasn't a confession. It was a conversation between two people who'd both learned that strength isn't about having it all together. It's about showing up anyway. Before he left, the priest asked if he'd consider speaking to their youth group sometime, not as a celebrity, but as someone who'd walked through grief and come out the other side still kind. He didn't say yes right away, but he didn't say no either. A few days later, he visited a community center a few blocks away. He'd been quietly funding a program there for years. Nothing flashy, just enough to keep lights on and tutors paid. This time he stayed longer, helped paint a mural with a group of teenagers, listened to a girl read a poem about her immigrant parents, shared a plate of beans and rice with a retired teacher who'd started the center in her garage 20 years ago. No one asked about the Pope. No one mentioned the interview. They just treated him like a person who showed up to help, and that, more than anything, reminded him why he'd spoken those words in the first place. Not for attention, but because he believed honesty could be a gift. Back in Rome, the Pope gave a Sunday homily that didn't mention Hollywood or interviews, but spoke about unexpected encounters that renew our hope. He talked about how grace often arrives not in grand cathedrals, but in ordinary rooms through ordinary voices. Sometimes, he said, God speaks through someone we never expected to listen to. The media didn't make much of it, but those who remembered the interview felt a quiet echo. Meanwhile, something small began to grow. Inspired by the conversation sparked by that one moment on air, a group of interfaith leaders in California launched a youth dialogue series. Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist teens meeting monthly to talk about ethics, identity, and how to live with integrity in a divided world. They called it Common Ground. He quietly covered the first year's operating costs, asking only that his name not be used. He didn't need credit. He just wanted the work to happen. At home, he started writing again. Not scripts, but letters. To people who'd written to him after the interview. A grieving widow in Ohio, a seminarian in Kenya, a teenager in Texas who said, "Your words made me feel less alone in my doubts." He answered each one by hand on simple stationery, no assistant, no filter. Just real words to real people. One afternoon, while sorting mail, he found a small package with no return address. Inside was a handmade rosary, wooden beads smooth from use, and a note. "Thank you for reminding us that holiness includes honesty." He didn't know who sent it, but he kept it on his nightstand. The world moved on, as it always does. New scandals broke, new celebrities rose. The headlines that once screamed about his shocking revelation faded into archives. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. In parishes across the country, priests began ending sermons with, "It's okay to have questions." In therapy offices, counselors used the interview as an example of healthy vulnerability. Even in corporate boardrooms, leaders started admitting when they didn't know something, calling it leading with humility, not weakness. None of it was because of him alone. But his moment of honesty had opened a door, and people were walking through it, not to tear things down, but to build something more human. One evening, sitting on his porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold, he thought about that meeting in Rome all those years ago. He hadn't known then that a few quiet words would ripple this far, but maybe that's how real change works. Not with explosions, but with whispers that find the right ears at the right time. He still didn't like the spotlight, still preferred silence to spectacle, but he no longer feared the weight of having spoken truthfully, because he'd seen what it could do, not destroy but connect, not divide but remind, and sometimes that's enough to change everything. The film festival wasn't in Cannes or Venice. It was a modest gathering in a coastal town, the kind where people still line up for tickets in the rain and filmmakers sleep on couches to save money. He hadn't planned to speak. He was only there because a friend's documentary was screening, a quiet, powerful film about hospice workers and the dignity of final goodbyes. But when the moderator asked if he'd take one question from the audience, he nodded. Just one. A young woman near the front stood up, microphone in hand. She looked nervous but determined. "After everything that happened," she began, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "do you regret saying what you said about the Pope?" The room went still. Cameras lifted. Even the seagulls outside seemed to pause mid-call. He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the crowd, not as fans, but as people. Some had tears in their eyes. Others leaned forward, curious. He saw a priest in the third row, an elderly couple holding hands, a teenager with a notebook open on their lap. Then he smiled. Not the polished smile of a celebrity, but the soft, tired kind that comes after a long journey. "I don't regret it," he said, because what he shared with me wasn't about power or doctrine. It was about being human. And if we can't talk about that, especially in places that claim to care about the soul, then what are we even doing? He paused, hands resting on his knees. We're all just trying to be kinder, to others and to ourselves. That was it. No grand speech. No defense. Just 11 simple words spoken like they were the most obvious truth in the world. The applause didn't start right away. It built slowly, like a wave gathering strength. First a few claps, then more until the whole room was standing. Not for a movie star, but for the quiet courage in those words. Not because they were shocking, but because they were true. Later, clips of the moment spread online. Not with dramatic music or bold text, but shared between friends with messages like, "This made me cry," or "Needed to hear this today." A high school teacher played it in class. A therapist used it in a session. In a monastery in Thailand, a monk translated it into Thai and pinned it to the community board. What happened next wasn't a headline. It was a shift, subtle, deep, and lasting. More public figures began speaking openly about their uncertainties. A senator admitted on the floor of Congress that she didn't have all the answers on climate policy, but was listening. A tech CEO canceled a product launch to say, "We got it wrong. We're going back to the drawing board." Even athletes started using post-game interviews to talk about mental health, not just wins and losses. And in churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples around the world, leaders began modeling something new. Not perfection, but presence. Not certainty, but care. A rabbi in Brooklyn started ending services with, "What questions are you carrying this week?" A mosque in Detroit hosted a doubt and devotion night where people could share struggles without shame. None of it traced directly back to him. But the seed had been planted, and it was growing in ways no one could have predicted. He kept living quietly. Still showed up to help at the community center. Still wrote letters by hand. Still walked his dog at dawn when the streets were empty. But something had changed in how people saw him. Not as a celebrity who'd caused a stir, but as someone who'd reminded them it was okay to be imperfect. Rumors began to circulate. Never confirmed. Never denied that he and the Pope exchanged letters once a year. Not about world events or theology, but about ordinary things. The changing seasons. The ache of missing someone gone too soon. The small joys of a shared meal or a quiet morning. People liked the idea. It felt like proof that connection could exist outside of spectacle. One winter evening, he received a package from Rome. Inside was a small book, hand-bound, with a simple title in Latin. Tucked in the front was a note. "For the days when the world feels too loud." Firmi opened it to find pages filled with reflections on silence, mercy, and the courage to stay open-hearted. He read it cover to cover that night by lamplight with a cup of tea going cold beside him. He never spoke of it publicly. But years later, when asked in a rare interview what kept him grounded, he said, "Knowing that even the most unlikely people can find each other in the dark and choose to walk together for a while." Back in Vatican City, the Pope never mentioned him by name again, but during a Christmas homily he spoke about the quiet witnesses among us, those who speak truth not to be heard, but to heal. The world didn't connect the dots, but those who'd been paying attention felt it like a warm hand on their shoulder, and that was enough. The story didn't end with a twist or a scandal. It ended the way real stories often do, with people changed not by drama but by depth, with conversations that started in living rooms and grew into movements, with a shared understanding that leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about holding space for the questions. Years from now, historians might barely mention the interview. But in homes and hearts it would live on, not as a moment of controversy, but as a turning point in how people thought about faith, fame, and the fragile beauty of being human, because what happens next doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes that whisper is what finally helps someone breathe again.